Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Over Coffee with Tonx, a show of conversations about coffee, culinary stuff, and culture, hosted by me, Tonx, longtime professional coffee nerd and occasional entrepreneur. For this first episode, I made the safest bet I could think of, which is inviting on my longtime friend, founder of San Francisco's Linea Caffe, Andrew Barnett. My friendship with Andrew spans a couple of decades, during which we've witnessed and commiserated about a lot of pretty dramatic changes that have happened in the coffee industry. In this episode, we talk about his origin story in coffee, dreaming about flavors. We lament how fancy coffee bars came to be seen as more bougie than blue collar. We talk about what to order if you're stuck at a Starbucks. And I digress into some cynicism about the current state of coffee bars, and Andrew talks me down from the ledge before I say anything too embarrassing. I hope you enjoy and can overlook a few of my technical stumbles. If you're watching this on YouTube, please leave a comment and say hi. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, I guess tell me how my voice sounds at 2x speed. Still weird? So without further ado, here is my conversation with Andrew Barnett. I am very happy to be talking today with Andrew Barnett, one of my favorite people in coffee, well known in coffee circles as the nicest man in coffee. And I hope that's a reputation that he can keep after this conversation. Because Andrew and I, we talk a lot and we shit talk a lot. We're both very opinionated and always find something to be a little bit grumpy about in the state of coffee. So, Andrew, this is my first episode, but I'm going to pretend that I've been doing this forever and say that I like to start off all of these episodes with the question of tell me about your first time. What was the experience with coffee, or a period in your life, or a shop, or what was the thing that sort of put you over the threshold into sort of having coffee become a serious relationship in your life?
Hey, Tony, great to see you and talk a little shit. And it's an honor to be a guest on your show. Just in terms of coffee, where it all starts, it's just being a kid. Remember going to the A&P with my mother and how she would grind up some coffee. They would have bulk beans section and how good it smelled. I just like, wow, this is the best smell in the world. It was incredible. And, I got old enough, they let me drink a bit of coffee, and I found it palatable if I put enough cream in there and sugar. And I thought, this is kind of tasty. But I didn't really get that interested in coffee till later in life. And I came in kind of through a strange entryway. I trained to be a dinner chef and was apprenticing to go that route. Got a gig at a coffee shop in San Francisco in 1976 called the Higher Grounds. And crazy enough, it still lives and exists in the Glen Park neighborhood. And it's walking into that place is like a time warp. The logos
That's
and
the
stained
original
glass.
location?
Yeah, it looks like you were in 1976. It's has coffee bags stapled to the jute coffee bags stapled to the ceiling. It was a little coffee bar, and it had a two-group Gaggia machine. And I tried to hustle a gig there by saying, I know how to cook and I can make your soups and salads, sandwiches, and your blintzes and all these things for you. And they asked me, can you make espresso? And I said, no. And I kind of hustled the gig and said, I can learn. And some of the people that I worked with, they'd worked in North Beach at some of the espresso bars, and they taught me a thing or two. And I thought I was pretty good after a few months and that I knew something. And if I probably look back at it now, I'd probably go, that coffee is pretty terrible. But, I like big milk drinks. I liked cappuccinos was my thing. And the place that we loved in San Francisco at the time was a place called Caffe Trieste. It's pretty well known. And they were making cappuccinos and lattes and espresso since the mid 50s. And that was a favorite place of mine. So that was my start into coffee, was really the later part. And I was about 19 years old when I started making coffee. And I loved it. I really loved it. And even though I had a culinary background and trained, I go, wow, coffee's so cool. And the more I learned about coffee, the more I realized I didn't know. And even though I trained as a dinner chef, it was the deeper I went, I thought this is a culinary pursuit as complicated as anything else. And to really get it right was as difficult as making creme brulee or making different sauces, a sauce mornay, or you name the sauces. That's a relatively easy one, but there were all these areas where it could be tightened up. And I've been doing this now for over 45 years, and I'm going, there are so many rabbit holes, and there's so many areas where you could make improvement. And as an industry, I think you find your recipes that work. You find out where you can fit in. I'm still trying to figure out where I fit in. But I love it. And I love coffee and espresso more than ever. And I dream about espresso. So that might make me an outlier in the quote unquote high end third wave.
I feel like you and I started roasting around the same time, maybe 20-ish years ago. But you had entrepreneurially, you'd opened up a shop quite a bit before that.
Yeah. So a little background on that, and just acknowledging that Tony and I share roots. We were both worked as baristas. We both worked as coffee roasters. I was living in Northern California. Tony was living in Seattle. My first coffee shop, my first enterprise was opened in 1994. It was a place called the Western Caffe, and it was up in Sonoma County in Santa Rosa, California. And I was serving coffees from David Schomer Espresso Vivace up in Seattle. And Tony, and he can tell you more on this, was working at Victrola Cafe up in Seattle, and they were also serving espresso vivace. So, and I was fortunate that my mentor was David Schomer, and he showed me his very unique perspective on how to prepare espresso and steam milk, and it was very specific recipe. And for me, it was a really great thing. At the time I discovered David was in 1993 at Coffee Fest in Seattle, and I had no idea about anything. And my sister-in-law, who lived up in Seattle, said, you should go to this Coffee Fest idea. And I had this all I need to do is get a coffee cart and find a good roaster like Starbucks and open up a coffee cart in Sebastopol, California, and I'll make $100,000 a year, easy. And I had no idea what equipment or what beans. And I happened to stumble on an espresso vivace booth, and David Schomer's making this coffee, and he's got this little camera that's in a screen showing people pouring latte art. And I'm like, what is that? That's 1993. And then I tasted David's coffee, and it was the sweetest coffee I'd ever had. It poured with the milk, and it was not dark roasted. And I went to a couple of David's lectures at Coffee Fest, and then I decided I'd go visit him at his shop, and the coffee was great. I carried David's coffee at my shops, which was probably, in terms of a business pathway or a kind of a branding exercise, no one knew who Espresso Vivace was in Santa Rosa, California. They did not know about him. And it didn't get me any customers, but we got known for having this really great coffee. And in 1994, when I finally opened, latte art was an anomaly. And the big thing in Northern California, and I'd say the West Coast, was this very dark roast style of coffee. A matter of fact, specialty coffee was kind of synonymous with dark roast coffee. You were kind of Starbucks dark roast or Pete's dark roast, and that was specialty coffee. So I'm going to hand this over to you, Tony. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about your pathway.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have 100 episodes of this for me to unravel the onion of my of my weird coffee career, accidental coffee career. I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting angle, is that my generation of coffee professionals, I think your generation of coffee professionals, is none of us really set out to be professionals. There's a lot of people that are kind of entrepreneur first, and the culinary ambitions come second.
I thought I knew a little bit about the business part of running cafes, and I didn't. And I didn't study business. I was an art student, and my love was coffee and the flavor and kind of what I thought it could be. And I think over the last 40 years, I know a little bit about business, enough to be dangerous. But I would say, I think there's the art side of making coffee, like making it for the flavor of coffee. And I've always liked the flavor first and dream about flavors. And then there's the people part, which I love. And then there's the business part, which I find interesting. And you kind of need to stay afloat in order to play the game, not lose money. And hopefully you're making money with this. There are people that are really good at business, but maybe they don't know that much about it. And it's probably the same could be said in a lot of different industries. Like, there are people that are really good at acting, people that are really good at directing movies, or really great cinematographers. And then there are people that are probably the money people that know how to get the money to make these movies and, see these big ships through and make money with it. Sometimes they don't. So there's the art side of the film industry and the recording industry, or you name it. Coffee, sometimes the artists are asked to try and do all of those things, which is a lot to take on.
So Linea's in San Francisco.
Yes.
And you've been living in San Francisco for a long time, and certainly in Northern California for forever. And it seems to me like it's one of the more interesting coffee cities for sure. There's a lot of players, a lot of very distinct styles, which I'm envious of when you're in a place where the coffee culture is maybe a little more stylistically homogenous. And it's also, I think, a really tough environment for small business to sort of keep their head above water and be successful generally. And I wonder if you have any feelings about life as a small business in San Francisco.
I think one is San Francisco many years ago used to be a very affordable town, a lot of blue collar folks and people who grew up here, and now it's a very expensive place to live, and like you could say that about New York and other cities of the world, that's just the way it is. So I think it's a harder climate to succeed in. It means in order to attract talented people to work with you, you need to pay a livable wage. So it's just a fact that you need to have benefits, you need to have all these things, or people can't afford to work for you and live in San Francisco or commute, a god-awful amount of time to get to the gig. So that's one part Rents are very expensive. Everyone's competing for the same places. So there's this very competitive vibe. So that changes the landscape of doing business. And even now, just getting things built, if you go, oh, I want to get something built and construct something, good luck getting affordable contractors and people to design the stuff. So you need to be really resourceful. And that's to say, not to say that it's impossible. I think that there's always room for creative, talented people who can maybe look at a way of thinking outside the box. So that happens. But it's more challenging. My gig is kind of what it's always been. I try and be as good as I can be, and um, work with the farms I work with that I really love working with, the producers, the importers. Some of those folks I've been working with 20 years now. What I do, I just like try and hone our recipes. I think I'm not interested in all the latest hotness. I am interested what people are doing, but you don't have to change everything all the time. I think there are people that like their comfort food, that go to In-N-Out Burger all the time. Not that we're In-N-Out Burger because they know they're going to get a consistent, delicious product. But we mix it up a little bit with what I call seasonal. We do a few different things with espresso, kind of what I call the Linea style, or even our filter coffee has a very, I'd say, unique expression. And I've always been driven towards flavors that are sweet, not cloyingly sweet, but I believe that coffee has a natural inherent sweetness to it. And that's kind of my gig. I would say, drinking your coffee, Tony, when I get a chance to, it's sweet, it's pleasant, it has a real nice, approachable feel to it. And I think that a lot of coffee is, people go, oh my God, you're a coffee pro, you've been doing it, you've got this refined palate. And I go, I don't know. I think that you do not need to be a coffee expert or have a huge vocabulary in order to dig delicious coffee. And I would make an analogy that kids know sweetness. If you give a 5-year-old child 5 different peaches and one is kind of just picked, and it's ripened and it has all these good things going for it. Maybe there's another peach that was just picked weeks earlier, or it's green and it's wasn't ripened the same way, and you slice up the peaches for a kid, they'll gravitate towards the one that's the sweetest. And I don't think you need this huge vocabulary or this great education to know good tasting coffee, and that it's a very approachable thing. And I think people get scared off by fancy espresso machines and fancy brew gear and coffee educators. And, we try and kind of, I say, demystify all of this and just get great coffee to people.
Something I struggle with is that, in coffee, we have the flavor wheel, we have a lot of, very sophisticated sounding language to talk about, how we grade and assess green coffee. But I think that language to me always falls really short in describing the differences between, you've got an Ethiopia Ukro on your menu right now, which I just cupped a few days ago and it was beautiful. And if we were to roast that same coffee, you and I could cup that, assess that, come up with, descriptors that I think are relevant to expressing what makes that green coffee selection unique. But if we try to describe the stylistic differences in your roast versus our roast, we don't have a really good descriptive language for saying like why, 3 or 4 samples of the same coffee from different roasters taste maybe dramatically different. And I'm not sure that that's like a problem with an easy solution. I've wrestled with that for, years. And, internally in kind of the environments where I've worked, certainly now with Yes Please, with Sumi, Aaron, Bronwyn, everyone that's in the cupping room, like there's shorthand and hand gestures and faces that you make and ways that you kind of express or try to like draw a line to things that are in the cup that you like or dislike, that are maybe somewhat ineffable, but they're not ineffable to the person who's there sitting there tasting that coffee in that moment. It's much easier to sort of be able to be in the same room, point to a cup of coffee that you're both sharing and say, like, this thing, do you taste that thing that's kind of like this? And it's in the middle and it sort of feels hollow, or like that works when you're one on one. And I think that's very actionable when you're in a sort of laboratory environment that's, a closed loop of all the people that are making decisions that can affect that can change that. The sort of, you know, industry consensus descriptive language for coffee, I think it's much less useful on the cupping table than it is, in sort of a SCA score sheet classification grading mentality.
And also, I don't want to marginalize or minimize people that taste coffee or different foods for a living, or say that, there is no point for education. I think I want to make drinking coffee more approachable for people, and that they don't feel stupid, that they need to have this flowery language in order to be able to sit at the table with the rest of us, and that it shouldn't be this intimidating thing. I like to turn people on. I mean, I'm excited about turning people on to flavor, but I've never seen myself as an educator. I'm just kind of like, hey, almost like, here's this flavor, and I dig it. Maybe you like it too, and I get pleasure in it, but I don't have any, I say, feel like I need to talk to anyone and tell them what's in that flavor. And matter of fact, I don't even know that they're going to like what I like or care for it one bit. And I think that some of taste is very subjective, it's personal, and some of it may even be genetic. I mean, I sit with people that are really, I remember sitting at favorite Burmese noodle bar in the Mission, Yamo, and sitting next to a chef, and he was asking his wife to pick out the cilantro because he couldn't stand it, the flavor of cilantro. And I love cilantro, and I don't know if it's a genetic thing that, the world might be divided into people who love cilantro and those that think it tastes like eating soap, maybe worse. And that is, I think the same could be said for coffee in different flavors. You get into all this stuff about, boozy coffees and anaerobic fermentation. Some people love it, some people hate it, and some people love kind of wildly fruity coffees, quote unquote, possibly natural coffees, and that can be divisive. And I think everyone's got their things they like.
When it comes to the coffees that you buy for Linea, do you act as kind of a gatekeeper for what coffees you say yes or no to? Is it sort of entirely like your taste that dictates like what the outer boundaries are? Or do you find yourself buying coffees that you're like, well, that's not really my style, but I think there's customers that we have or people inside of the company, the crew that might like that coffee? Like where's your fence there?
That's a great question. I'd say the first thing I ask myself, I mean, we have our own, what I call Linea check boxes. Do we know the farmer? Do we like the farmer? Most of what we purchase right now is certified organic. There are a few outliers. We buy coffees from El Inerto, which is the first carbon neutral farm in Guatemala. Their coffees are amazing. But the thing I ask myself, is that coffee sweet? Is it a sweet coffee? and maybe some of that's how we roast it and develop it. In terms of would I want to drink a whole cup of it every day of the week? Some coffees, yeah, I could drink that coffee all day long, every day. I would want that coffee as a filtered coffee, a pour over, as a Chemex, as a Hario, as an AeroPress, brewed as espresso. And then there are coffees that I kind of go are maybe a little bit wild, they're a little bit more fruity. We have a coffee from Ethiopia from Shikiso, and it's got some of the wild berry notes in it, which I really love, but it's not the thing that I want to drink all day long. It's like I like little tastes of that. So that's just kind of, but every coffee in our lineup, I go, yeah, I would like to drink that coffee. And there are coffees too that I guess I go, yeah, I respect that coffee. It's sweet. It's got some nice notes, but maybe it's a little too boozy for me to want to just drink all the time. Maybe it's an anaerobic um, fermentation. I go, well, that's interesting, but not my thing, and that's probably what makes the world go round. And other people might be like, oh my God, this is the most amazing coffee. You've got to drink this. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. It's like being in the fashion business. Things go in and out of style. There are trends, there's new hotnesses that everyone follows into and they feel this is it. But I'd say there's a lot of, like the music industry or the film industry, I think people find out what the latest hotness is and everyone chases it. And, someone goes, oh, got an EK43. I need to have an EK43 to be in business. And I love EK43s, but I think that they're just things that are trends that everyone feels they need to be doing certain things to be legit. They, may even copy the same flavor descriptors. And I just segueing back on that is, I think flavor descriptors are really its own minefield because we'll say this is a chocolate flavor. Well, what flavor of chocolate is it? There are thousands of flavors of chocolate. What's a peach flavor? And then even, is it reminiscent of peach? Or is it really taste like peach? That maybe because we don't even have the vocabulary, we go, it's peach. It's totally peach. You can get 3 or 4 people to agree on it.
Right. Or you have to go into the whole stone fruit pantheon and find, is it more apricot? Is it nectarine? Is it pluot? Like, where does it fall on the stone fruit spectrum? I mean, chocolate's interesting to me because it's one that I use a lot as like kind of a softball descriptor. But then I see a lot of roasters and a lot of other coffee pros who treat chocolate as like a euphemism for dark roast. And not like as someone who really loves chocolate and thinks about sort of, the various nuances of really good chocolate.
That's really interesting. I think for a lot of people, chocolate became synonymous with a dark roast and it became a dirty word, which is interesting because one of my favorite flavors in the world is chocolate. And there's just a myriad of chocolate flavors. It's a rainbow of flavors. But I think that is kind of certain coffee professionals think of that as a dirty word or a very uncool thing for coffees to be.
How do you make coffee at home? What's your daily driver right now?
So how I start the day, so I make pour over coffee at home. So there are 3 ways. My wife Caffe and I, fortunately for me, she loves to drink coffee, and I make pour over, and I'd say 90% of the time I make Chemex, and I love Chemex, and I've got this little recipe that I've been working on over the years, and it makes delicious coffee all the time. And no matter what bean I'm using, it's great, and it's really consistent and solid, and I love the simplicity of it.
I feel like I promised the listeners shit talk, and
yeah,
you and I, when we talk privately, like we're always finding, something to throw shade on. As roasters, we cut our teeth at a time when, espresso was dominant. Most of the manual brewing devices that are popular today weren't on the market then, or were much harder to get. You've seen the evolution of kind of what espresso culture in the United States is from a much bigger arc than I think most of us who are in the industry today can speak to. And I'd be kind of interested in your take on that.
My lens was always very espresso focused. And later on, I, became a client of David Schomer's. And then later opened up espresso bars and was very espresso focused. And there was no filter coffee. And then 2000, I bought a Diedrich roaster and started learning how to roast. And I owned this little coffee bar with a partner, and we parted ways, and she kept the coffee bar, which was all espresso. And I like, oh crap, I've got to make some money with this and hustle some wholesale accounts, or I'm going to not be able to feed myself. So I thought just selling espresso in Sonoma County, that's a pretty weak business model, and started selling coffee to people. And I would obsess on espresso, but I bought a Chemex, and I should have an idea of what the brewed coffee tastes like, and my lens still is espresso. That's what I dream about. Even my colleagues, the people I work with, they love to cup, which I love to do, but they love the batch brew coffee and the Hario pour overs, which I do. But man, I'm the one in the companies dreaming about the espresso. So that's what I want first thing in the morning.
Are we talking literal dreaming? Do you like wake up in the morning with like, oh, I had a dream about pulling shots or making a new blend?
No, I dream about flavors, which is weird. Some people dream about colors. Occasionally I do, but I'll dream about flavors and I'll go, oh, wow, this. And I'll wake up and it's dreaming about espresso. And it's not filter coffee. It's definitely espresso that I dream about. I dream about other flavors too. But that's my own weird makeup and probably why I'm such a troubled individual. But this is, in terms of espresso culture and how this whole thing evolved, I don't know. I mean, I just think Starbucks is really good at what they do. I talked about them. I think about them all the time. I think they're a very successful coffee company. And they're really good at selling milk and espresso with it and frappuccinos and all this other stuff and really cold drinks. Someone was telling me that 80% of their beverages worldwide are iced drinks, which I find mind-boggling.
Yeah, I mean, that's my advice to people if they have to go to Starbucks is stick to the cold stuff. You can't deny a frappuccino is a pretty tasty thing.
What's not to like? So,
I mean, they're union busting. There's plenty of points to score with our audience of 7 people that are probably with this podcast for episode 1. To basically like, I feel like as an industry, we all got to this like mature place where we acknowledge how important Starbucks is to creating the category that we're all pretending to thrive in. When I started in coffee, it was like just after WTO Seattle. Starbucks was an avatar of globalization and working at, a small mom and pop. If you had a successful business, they were going to look for real estate on your block. Like, they weren't seen as a colleague or as a predecessor, but as a predator that wanted to put you out of business. And at some point, like, everybody just got a little kind of Unitarian about it or something, and we decided that Starbucks is an ally in the big picture. And I wonder if you have any feelings about that.
I mean, I just saw them as they do what they do and I do what I do. When I was up in Santa Rosa, I had a little espresso cart inside of a newsstand, and it was really not even 100 yards away from a Barnes and Noble that had a Starbucks inside of it. And I happen to know the managers there, and I knew our numbers, and we were growing about 20% a year. They weren't. Um, we had our own style of making coffee. They had bigger numbers, they had longer hours, and they had bigger staffs, and we kept growing, and I never saw them as a big threat because they're so different from what I was doing, and I felt like I wouldn't mind being across the street from a lot of the Starbucks because they're really good at picking locations. So, some people saw them as the, the big threat, and they have a lot more money than most of the small mom and pops. But I think if you're good at what you do and you create something that's different, Starbucks isn't a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, a lot of the sort of differentiation in third wave specialty coffee, whatever, was about sort of pushing against Starbucks. And I think that created this thing where we tried to be like fancier, where we tried to like sort of, you know, out serious. Like Starbucks isn't serious, we're serious. Like is this elevation around all of the sort of, smoke and mirrors and procedural elements about the coffee. The impact of that is that when somebody walks into like, an Intelligentsia or a Blue Bottle or something, they feel like it's this luxury, elevated, expensive, premium, bougier than, Starbucks, which is like, McDonald's, Subway sandwiches, like it's a big chain, and we wanted to kind of differentiate that, and so you get, all of these sort of signifiers of authenticity. And when I first got into beer as a beer nerd in the late 90s, like if you cared about beer more than what just came in a can, like if you got anything that was imported, this was New York City in the 90s, there weren't very many or hardly any like bars where you could get really a good selection of beer, certainly not what would become called craft beer. And if you were into that, like you were a beer snob. Then there was this explosion of a resurgence, I guess, of craft brewing in America. And I feel like it, people were willing to pay a premium price for it. They would go and, throw down good money at their local brew pub. And, this is a much easier to manufacture product with higher margins. And, people didn't think twice about throwing down really good money for a premium version of a product in that category, and still feel like it's a blue collar beverage. They walk that line much better than us. And I think that there is something that felt kind of way unnecessarily exclusive, or, that you had to have an educated palate to like really understand why our coffee was so good. And it's just, this all seems like a self-defeating bullshit. And then it became an arms race of all of these small roasters finding, new ways to sort of split hairs. The attack surface for us was that everybody thought, we're printing money. We're taking it like, this is like this thing of, you see a line out to the street of people waiting to pay, $3 for a cup of coffee. And, that can't be right. And, meanwhile, down the street, the bar is, pouring you a half glass of Chimay for $8 and you're going to tip $1 and not think twice about it. And I just feel like coffee didn't really, we missed the mark on messaging around the culinary story without dressing it up in all of this culinary burlesque around gourmet pretenses and shit. And anyway, you've heard me rant about that 500 times in our phone calls.
And I've enjoyed that. I think one of the things is just coffee is expensive to make, to really, it's and our listeners know that it takes this, if you're doing it at a coffee bar, it takes this level of involvement and care for it to taste good or to work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And how do you have a success rate with that, and then get guest, and make that all work. And it's expensive. And I'd say and people have made the argument, it's actually by the time you pay the farmers and all the other labor, and it's much more expensive to produce that really high quality cup of coffee than the wine. But there is pushback from the guest if you go over a certain price point. They'll go, well, $5 for a cup of coffee, that's insane. You are gouging us. You are ripping us off. And that's bougie. But maybe that same individual will spend, you know, $11, $12, $13, $14 for an average cup of wine, you know, and that's a different experience. But the beer, I don't know what a good tasty beer is these days. If it's $5, $6, people spend that with much less labor involved than the coffee. And I had one of my colleagues years ago said, well, he said that the alcohol may get you laid, the coffee won't. I can't speak to that.
Yeah,
but,
I don't know. I don't know if that's been my experience.
but I'd say the coffee has been historically a cheaper beverage, at least in the U.S. It's something, there's still the tradition of free refills. I won't speak to whether that's good or bad. I think colleagues would go, that's terrible. Maybe if you're the recipient and someone's giving you more coffee, but a lot of restaurants feel that that model should exist and maybe live into perpetuity. And I always thought that, you know, for what I call high-end quality coffee, that was a horrible business model because no one's going to refill your glass of wine or another plate of food or give you another beer on the house, but they will do that with coffee. And that, you know, I complained about that 22 years ago, and that's still a real thing. But that would be, you know, I don't know whether that's old curmudgeon Barnett complaining about just the way things are. People do, I think there's price sensitivity on that, but it's interesting, the people that might be upset at paying more than $4 for a 12-ounce cup of coffee, they may go down later in the afternoon or spend $6 or more for a Frappuccino and be happy to spend that and feel, you know, entitled to that. So it's how do you set the table for folks and how do you communicate that stuff and what is a fair price for a cup of coffee? We had someone complaining because we had someone at our shop, they gave us a 3-star review on Yelp because one of our bags of beans was $30 and kind of go, that's valid for people that kind of not want to pay so much if they can get coffee somewhere else. I mean, there are places to get cheaper coffee. Go to Costco and you can get some great deals on Starbucks coffee that's going to be much less expensive, or different places to get these beans. But I'd say, you know, as an entrepreneur, I'm thinking, how do I pay the farmers the most money I can and not nickel and dime them? How do I pay my staff? How do I pay my rent? How do I pay all these other things? Not to moan about that, but how do you survive in this market? There's been a lot of consolidation since you and I have entered into the coffee roasting, the mom and pop side of things. You know, we've been doing this for over 20 years. Some of our colleagues have received big investment from Wall Street firms and also from privately held larger German families that are kind of behemoth what they own and their market share of what the coffee industry is. And, you know, the small mom and pops, it's really hard to compete with those companies. You know, that large German conglomerate, and, you know, they do what they do, but they can get terms on their coffee where they don't have to pay the importers for 365 days. You and I have to pay our bills within 30 days or we're cut off. So it's just a different scale of operations.
Yeah. Yep.
You have any heroes in this after all these years? Like people who go, I love working with this person. They're awesome. There'll probably be some of your guests on the show.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, you know, you're my first guest because you're high on that list. Like we've gotten to do some cool stuff together over the years. I mean, I think, we could bring up Slow Food Nation and talk about that for for an hour, really, because that event in 2008 that you, I, and Eileen Hasse from Ritual curated that era in kind of both coffee and the food world, and in the changing conversations around how people looked at the supply chain inside of food was really different. I mean, I feel like, to my mind, that's like kind of the period around which what we might call the third wave of coffee was kind of hitting its zenith. I've been really lucky to fall in with a crowd of people who were doing pioneering work in coffee. I mean, I think you and I both had the experience of being in coffee around the time that the internet first became a piece of the conversation, that professionals and serious hobbyists were sharing notes for the first time, and starting to like build a rough map of a landscape of who's who and who's doing what and what coffees do you need to try, and the sort of first producers to sort of come into the room on that. People like Edwin Martinez, who I will be asking to be a guest very soon.
He's awesome.
And and kind of how that it was this fertile period of of people sharing ideas, and a lot came out of that era, because it was still so many things about coffee, so many things about espresso, so many things about the idea of what a coffee bar could be or should be, what we should be educating people about or not. What was all a jump ball, and kind of everybody could participate. And I think for those of us that got to be a part of that, it was cool and exciting. And I think it's a very different landscape now, and that you can go to a couple of trade shows and there's so many of them so often. And and there's going to be booths of people who if you're a noob to coffee, like somebody's going to try to sell you a roasting machine. Somebody's going to try to sell you an espresso machine. Somebody's going to convince you to jump into the coffee business head first. But it just feels like it's a much bigger industry. And I feel like there was a time not that long ago where, you went into a new city and you found a place that had like a decent espresso machine. You were like, oh, this is, it was worth, if somebody was roasting coffee in Kansas City and they popped up on the internet, you were going to get on a plane and go to Kansas City and, Broadway coffee, like you were going to taste what those guys were doing, because
Sure.
they were one of just a handful of people that were even playing around in this arena. And I feel like at that time it was very exciting. You experienced a lot of, distinct stylistic choices that people were doing with their roasting, or the kind of coffees that they thought were of quality. It felt vibrant and different. And now there's, I think, a set of like orthodoxies and best practices and assumptions, and in the way that people roast and the way that people brew, and stuff like tools like Cropster that have created this kind of homogenous floor where like you can expect that you can go into almost any city and find a roaster who's reasonably skilled at what they're doing and is following a good set of best practices, and you're going to reliably get a beverage that hits par and is better than what you can get at Starbucks. And you can sort of take for granted that like that our movement won, that like a decent coffee bar, espresso bar culture has taken root. But on the sort of exciting end, it's hard for me to sort of feel that same impulse of like, oh man, I've got to like get on a plane to New York because the shop just opened and they're doing this, and it's, and it's an experience that's going to be very different than, no, it's not. You're going to go and you're going to find an experience that's kind of somewhere on par, above par to what everybody else is doing, buying the same green coffees everyone else is buying, roasting them to the same, curves on on a a software program as other roasters are doing, using the same equipment, tuned the same way. Baristas following roughly the same paradigm on the same equipment. That it's not as much of an adventure to go to a new shop. And personally, when I go to a new shop, which I've just, post pandemic, it's still a pandemic, but starting to like explore some of the many new shops that have strangely opened during the pandemic here in LA. And it's, as someone who's been on both sides of the counter for many years, it's hard for me to go into a shop and not sort of be mentally armchair quarterbacking the decisions that were made about, where they put the machine, how they greet people, how they merchandise the coffee, like what the menu looks like, what the acoustics and the atmosphere, and who is this for? Does it fit in the neighborhood? Like, what statement are they trying to make? And so it's, I don't know if for newer people or younger people in the industry, it's a very different perspective in how they approach that. But you've been in this longer than me. Are you over coffee? do you walk into a shop and feel like, can you get excited about it? Does it often seem like I've seen this before? Or like where's the novelty for you in this?
I would say there's some people doing exciting things right now, and that those are, there are people doing some exciting stuff that's different, that they're out there, that they're not doing cookie cutter, that they have their own unique takes on it. Sometimes they're presenting coffee from not just one roaster. They're doing the multi-roaster thing. They're trying to brew their coffees different ways. But I'd say people have fun with it. They're doing cool things. In New York, you have coffee bars that are, really literally farm to cup, where, the importer has the coffee bar in New York. And that's a pretty cool concept. Is the coffee better? I don't know. It's, but I think these are, it's interesting. I would say that it's probably like everything else, that 99% of it is just people copying what's already been done. Is that bad? Who's to say? What does it need to be original? If it's a tasty beverage, great. And I wish all entrepreneurs all the best. It's pretty rough out there to just pay the bills and pay yourself and make a go of it. Probably harder than ever, and especially with COVID and everything else. So I'm rooting for those folks, and I'm not trying to dismiss them. But do I get excited about it? I don't know. I haven't been a coffee bar. I'm just a couple since the pandemic. I'm really more San Francisco bound, so I can't really say. And I kind of walk over to the cafes and, between my house and tasting coffee and doing what I do, it's not as interesting a lens for, go back 12, 13 years. I was going to coffee bars throughout Los Angeles, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Copenhagen, Paris, London, etc. So I miss that world. So it's hard for me to really say. In terms of Cropster, which is a software device for cafes now, and also for measuring what's going on inside of a roaster, and not just what's going on inside of the roaster, but in terms of how much coffee you're roasting per week, which coffees you're roasting, and keeping track of it. I think it's a very valuable tool, at least in keeping track of coffee inventories, roasts. But I think it's a tool. And I would say to a younger roaster, learn how to smell the coffee, learn how to cook it. And, I was fortunate and I'm fortunate. I learned on a Diedrich IR12, and I didn't even have a real gas pressure reading meter. So my whole world was based on looking at flame, or actually at infrared burners, and learning how to adjust my roast based on how things looked and flying by the seat of my pants. And, you know, my background was cooking, so that was kind of the world I worked in. And then tasting the results. And, I'd have to write down everything at 2-minute intervals. Cropster makes that very immediate. Which is better? I think maybe it's a combination of both worlds, but I don't really worry about it, but I'd say I observe that there are individuals who say the coffee is good because of the numbers. It is good because they've hit these digital metrics, or they can see the performance in Cropster or TDS, and therefore it is a good tasting coffee. But I think it's all about the palate. I think that the human tongue, our brain, our sense of smell is the best computer there is, and that you learn to trust your ability to taste, and use these other tools. That's fine. They're augment those tools with your brain, and then you've got something.
Right. Yep. I'm with you 100%. I think that as Terrence McKenna said, the felt presence of immediate experience, that you have to put that in the foreground. That you have to trust your own senses. And another trope I bring up all the time is, when I meet someone who's new in coffee, a young barista, and like I ask, like, what's, you've got 4 coffees on the menu, what one do I want? Like, I expect that somebody who loves coffee enough to like take a low paying job working inside of it and treat it as like part of a career path, which is a big deal, that that they should have feelings about coffee. And I think that there's like a thing that happens, especially at at shops that have a really good reputation, where a lot of people come into it new and they sort of embrace this extreme humility that, well, look, I'm just learning. I've only been a barista for 6 months. I don't, even when they don't know that I'm a fellow coffee professional, even if I'm just a guy off the street, where I'm going to get a lecture about how, oh, I couldn't possibly tell you what's good. I haven't been doing this long enough to tell you like what's good. Like, I can tell you, some chapter and verse about, flavor notes that are on this bag that may or may not have any relevance to if the coffee's any good or not. But so I think that there's like a thing that happens at a lot of these companies where, there's a couple people's opinion who matter, who maybe get to make some decisions about what coffees get selected or how they're roasted or in what ways that they're prepared. And then, a lot of people who are kind of stuck, just kind of serving that however it's been presented to them. And I think like, barista competitions and things have kind of, centered the barista in these conversations about the culinary aspects of coffee as sort of, they're the ones talking to the customer. They're the, the vanguard and the educators. But that, in my mind, like, if you are the one getting your hands dirty with the coffee, like you should take the gloves off. You should, maybe it doesn't make sense in your shop or in the environment that you're in or the company that you're in or while you're still learning, but you should have at least some moment in your craft or on your career path where you can change the pressure on the espresso machine. You can reblend the coffee in a way that you think is going to make more sense. That this whole podcast thing is just going to be me like spitballing half-baked pieces of unfinished essays towards a book that will probably never be written.
That's great. I can't wait.
Yeah.
We'll prod you on to write that book.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, is there anything
book.
else you want to share with the wide world of Over Coffee with Tonx listeners, all 17 of them maybe?
No. Tony's one of my heroes in coffee. What a pleasure it is to hang out with Tony for a bit and be a guest on this podcast. And thank you all for listening.
Yeah. Thanks for being on, Andrew. And we'll undoubtedly talk soon. And I'll have you on as a guest again when I hit some anniversary number of episodes and actually get kind of good at this because, got a ways to go.
Awesome. Can't wait. Thanks, Tony.
I'd like to say thank you to everyone that made it to the end of this episode, who got through the whole thing. I really appreciate you being a listener. This is just the beginning for me, and hopefully I'm learning the ropes okay. There's no advertiser for this, but if you want to feel like you're supporting this podcast and my ability to continue doing this podcast in the future, I happen to have a coffee roasting company and we're really good. You can find us at www.yesplease.coffee, YESPLZ. And we would love to send you some coffee. And I should probably throw a promo code in here, but it's my first episode. So all of this is terribly, terribly new to me. But I thank you again for coming on this journey, and bonus points for all of you who made it this far. Thank you so much.